How's everybody? So today I'm going to talk to you guys about a completely different approach to governments. We spent a decade or more in this industry trying to fight with governments, trying to demand clarity and regulations and so forth. It never occurred to anybody that maybe the best strategy was to onboard governments directly. And so we came to this epiphany at Balcony through the process of starting what we thought was going to be a DAO. And our DAO was going to purchase a bunch of real estate and fractionalize it and actually fulfill this mission of permissionless access to decentralized investments in a real world asset, give people the opportunity to invest in the highest caliber real estate. And what we found out was it's not possible. There's actually no way to do that. And so we pivoted and we decided it was time to tokenize governments. Governments are the substrate for all real world assets. Without government validation of a real world asset, you can't really tokenize it. So how do you do it? First, you have to figure out which government. This is the snapshot in the United States. 50 states, 440 federal agencies, 3,000 counties. I rounded down, it's actually more like 3,200. 36,000 municipalities. There's 22 million government employees in the United States of America alone. And in every one of those 3,000 plus, it's actually 3,200 counties, they are recording title and deed to these properties. This is what a typical municipality might look like. This is shrunken down, by the way. But in a typical municipality, you have all of these departments spread across 36,000 versions of it, spread across 3,000 counties. All of this, no standardization whatsoever, no interoperability in that software at all. Every single one of these municipalities has their own set of vendors, they have their own technology stack. If you think interoperability in the blockchain is rough, you should look at how governments operate. There is virtually no standard. And so when you're thinking about how you tokenize real estate, when you understand that these are the people who need to validate that asset and they have no standard, this is the reason why Balcony had to pivot and had to move into tokenization of governments. There needs to be a single source of truth that operates interoperably in a way that people can trust, that is authenticated, that is immutable, and also that is impervious to hacks. Turns out governments also need us. The need for governments here is kind of surprising to people in this room. You know, as blockchain first maximalists, we find it hard to believe that there's actually a requirement that we have government intervention in these assets. But I assure you, we want the government. The government's maintaining our public records. There's not a single document that exists that actually proves ownership of any real estate asset that exists in the United States. Ownership is actually the triangulation of several different documents to probabilistically prove ownership of an asset. It's a lot of records. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of records per property across all of those 36,000 municipalities. Those records are used to enforce these property rights. If you have a dispute, you want to be able to adjudicate that dispute. You want a government to do that. The alternative is you get really big guns and you do it yourself, which is really less than ideal. You want your land use regulated. This by itself is a massive amount of data and a massive amount of planning. And we want our governments to be able to do these things for us as well. But to do that correctly, they require strong documentation. Likewise with taxation. Most importantly, we want governments because without them, there really cannot be a real estate market as we know it. It's effectively impossible to finance real estate in the absence of a jurisdictional validation of ownership. If you cannot prove perfect title, there will not be loans, there will not be a real estate market, and that's kind of That's kind of a big deal because this is the largest asset class. $326 trillion globally, but even in the United States, where we have a $26 trillion real estate market, $18 trillion of that is debt. And all of that debt requires perfect lien on those assets. If a lender cannot prove that they have unclouded title to a property, they're not going to finance it. And so it's imperative that we bolster these records and that we make lien clear and perfect and concise. And this is really what we do in the blockchain. And so it's been a surprising sort of circuitous path here for us at Balcony, because we started off this project thinking we just need to be able to atomically trade real estate. And what we found out was the reason why we can't is because governments lack the basic tooling that we take for granted in our space. There's nobody in this room who has any problem determining who the owner of a given digital asset is. For us, it's just obvious. But the government has a big problem with this. In fact, deed fraud is one of the largest problems plaguing these governments all across the country, across the world, really. And deed fraud is something that could never exist on the blockchain. Nobody ever disputed who owns a Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT. It's never happened. It's literally impossible in our industry. And so by providing this tooling to governments, we're now bolstering their records and making it possible for us to actually trade these assets atomically. I wanted to speak for just a second as well on where most people go. Most people see these challenges with governments, and rather than try to tokenize governments and bring governments onto the blockchain, their response is, well, we'll just do a digital twin. It'll be identical to the asset. We'll create this sort of parallel universe where we can actually trade it on our crypto rules. And it's not worked, and it never will work. You cannot trade a real world asset without having a tether between that asset and the actual laws that define that property. Keep in mind, in real estate, you don't just buy a property. It's not just an asset, it's also a liability. You have to pay things like taxes. You have to know who owns the property so that you can issue tax assessments. There's no world ever, period, full stop, where there will ever be a digital twin that is not tethered to an actual jurisdiction for a real world asset. That day will never come. And unfortunately, we spent the last, 5 years trying to develop digital twin proxies and all these newfangled types of tokens to circumvent these laws that I hope I've demonstrated to you exist for a good reason, and we just want to bring into the 21st century and allow us to trade these assets atomically. We need to have legal recognition. They have to be tethered to the actual asset, and you have to find a way to actually close atomically, which is also something that is virtually impossible today, to actually coordinate the 10 or 12 or 15 or 30 different parties to a transaction so that you could actually close title. So here's our vision. Balcony's vision is, let's tokenize these governments, bring them all onto the blockchain, allow all of that infrastructure to work identically to the tooling that we see today, that we use for DeFi projects, that we use all across the blockchain. Let's allow for all the metadata that describes these assets to be placed on chain so anybody can inspect it. Make the entire process transparent so that lenders, tax collection, liens, exchanges, governments, individual users, institutions can all operate on the same single source of truth to transact, as opposed to 36,000 different tech stacks across N number of banks and intermediaries. Let's standardize this entire system, and let's make this something that can actually settle atomically, that can actually exist on chain. And that's what we've done. So we have a 4-step program over here. It's pretty simple. First one is we take every single piece of data that exists for a government and we bring it on chain and we tokenize it. We've done this now in the city of Orange, New Jersey, Fort Lee, New Jersey, Cliffside Park, New Jersey. We're talking to 3 counties in New York State, the entire state of Wyoming, and several other states as well that we're still working our deals out with, along with several federal agencies. and they're migrating all of this data onto our network. Once that is tokenized, we then go through the process of normalizing it, standardizing it, and productizing it. So making sure, for example, something as simple as your address, 123 Main Street, can be written many different ways. It could be 123 Main ST, it could be 123 Main Street, it could be 123 Main S period. Standardizing just the most trivial of details is a job in and of itself. And then being able to take that data that's once standardized, productize it back is the next step, where now the municipalities, the governments that we want to do business with as our partners on the blockchain, can now consume this data and interact with it in a way that is much more efficient. And then after that, we enrich that data. Then we reach out to our private parties in our private markets and we ask them to contribute their data, which we can store encrypted and immutably and permissioned on the exact same layer of blockchain, the same single source of truth, so that this data can be made available to lenders, it can be made available to REITs, investment partners, insurance companies. And then the last thing that we want to do is automate that entire process and allow for actual atomic settlement in a room or not virtually, so that this property can trade in ways that is governed by smart contracts and governed by code. The future that we are laying out in the balcony is actually happening right now. This is beyond theory. We spent 3 years building these products and onboarding actual governments. And my recommendation to any of you that have an interest in real world assets is to work with governments and make sure you have government participation on any digital asset that you issue and any real world asset that you trade, hypothecate, lend against, or exchange. Thank you guys for listening to this lecture. And if you have any questions, there's a few minutes left. I'd love to answer any questions you may have.
Have you thought about writing standards with governments so that they can create an SOP that they will agree to for blockchain solutions for these real estate assets?
Yeah, we are creating standards right now. So in New Jersey, for example, there's a standard called Mod 4. Mod 4 is the standard used to classify all real estate throughout the state. It was written 40 years ago. It is fairly incomplete. By way of example, it only allows you to register a sale of a property up to and including like $100 million, or actually $999 million. You can't actually trade a $1 billion property on it. It's sort of like the Y2K bug, but for real estate in 2024. And so we are now extrapolating all that data, rewriting these standards, and then disseminating them across states and building sort of like a transformer, a way for every one of these individual states' existing standards to continue, but then feed into a universal standard in the country so that somebody in Bangladesh can buy a piece of property in Brooklyn in the same way that he would buy it in Boise. All of those data fields, all those column headers end up lining up.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Is anybody here from government? My prediction is that this is going to be the #1 thing that you're going to see change over the next 5 years in this industry. You're going to start to see more and more government people are going to be coming to these events, and more you're going to start to see the government move on to the blockchain. And that's where real world assets gets unlocked.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for your kind words. We're going to take a 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Make some noise.